When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. I remember him telling me stories, but I have no recollection of what they actually were. My dad traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into. And when I started telling him about my dresser buddy, he wanted to know his name. It was something innocent like Peter, but I can still see him going white in the face as I told him. I then drew a picture of Peter for him. The very next day, my dad and my uncle took out the dresser and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later when I found out my dad's little brother also had the same friend with the same name who lived in the same antique dresser. After a few months of the typical imaginary friend stuff, my uncle started having nightmares and couldn't sleep because of Peter. It got so bad that they had to move him out of his room before he managed to get back to normal. The first time I moved away from home, I lived in an old cabin-like house. I never had a good night's sleep in there. I always tossed and turned and woke up several times during the night. But it wasn't until a few weeks later, stuff started to get really weird. In the beginning, it was just small things that I didn't really think too much about, like keys missing and cups and plates not being where I thought I had left them. Then I started waking up in the morning to find various drawers opened and things laying around like someone had been in a hurry searching for something. I even came home to a wide open main door and decided to change the lock. But even then, when I was home with the door locked, I could walk past and just in the corner of my eye, see the door slide open. One time, I was cat sitting one of my friend's cats, and it would just sit for hours in the middle of the room and toss its tail from side to side and watch as if it was following something around the room with its eyes. It creeped me out. If you can only imagine what it felt like to see the cat slowly following something that floats randomly around the room and finally stop right beside you. After a while, I just could not live there anymore and finally moved out. A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it was this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this, and it stopped. Then after a week or so, it began again. The exact same noise, exact same time. Finally, one day, he decided to back dial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about. Still, the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were left. He decided to say screw it, ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time, he was terrified every night, unsure why this was happening. He dialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time, he lost his job and his phone. The call stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. One day, my mom is asking me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother, and he was freaking out. He dialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. Heard a tapping on my window at night. The next morning there was a handprint on the outside of my window. I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me, don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around. It was quiet, besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. My grandfather died last year, sometime when my son was maybe a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday night, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was a very quiet, proud man, but when he thought he was alone or unseen, he would make silly faces at my son to get a laugh. A couple of nights after his funeral, my son, who liked to crawl into bed with us in the middle of the night, started just laughing uncontrollably at like 2 a.m. I got out of bed to see what's going on, and I find my son sitting in the middle of the living room, in the dark, laughing. I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" He says, "Papa, funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up and bring him to our room for the rest of the night. As I'm carrying him away, he says, "Bye, Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see. When I was growing up, one of my best friends told me about a very creepy situation that involved him, his younger brother, and a man in the window. When my friend and his little brother were younger, they shared the bedroom. They're some years apart, but his younger brother was born with a multitude of different health issues, and he's confined to a wheelchair and cannot care for himself. So, to keep an eye on him overnight when his parents couldn't, they shared a bedroom. One night, my friend randomly woke me up for no reason and happened to glance over at his younger brother, but noticed something very startling. A strange silhouette of a man wearing a top hat looking in through the window behind his younger brother's crib. The first thing my friend did was jump up and turn the light on. He then ran into his parents' room to tell them what he saw. When his parents came back into the room to investigate, his younger brother was having a seizure. A few of his family members say it was his younger brother's guardian angel standing in the window that night. It was death. It's all still pretty unsettling to me. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip that was called the Louisiana Tour. It was mostly going around to significant sites in South Louisiana. One of the places we went was Myrtle's Plantation, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point, we were standing in a room as a part of a larger group, and the tour guide was talking about something. I don't remember what. As I'm standing there, I start to hear what sounds like someone hitting a piano key. After I heard it a couple more times, I started to look around for the source of the noise. I didn't see a piano, but I kept hearing it. So I asked my friend, who was standing near me, if he had heard it. He said no. When I heard it again, I said, "There it is again." They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide, except for one woman. She caught my eye and pointed at me, and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I heard it too, and I nodded. At this point, the tour guide starts telling a story about a soldier who had died there, and that he played the piano and multiple guests had reported hearing him playing in the night. I really don't know what to think. I talked to the woman as we were all leaving the room, and she had heard the exact same thing as me, but her husband and son hadn't heard it. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening. My son, 3 at the time, needed to go to the bed at that point. I walked with him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room that my mother-in-law passed away was upstairs, and straight down the hallway as he reached the top of the landing. My son and I walked upstairs, together with me, holding his hand. As we reached the top of the stairs, my son stopped and wouldn't move. At the point which he could just see down the hallway, he was staring straight down the hall. I looked at him, then down the hall, to an open doorway to a completely dark bedroom. He just stared and would not move anymore. I asked him, "Buddy, are you okay?" His response was, "Daddy, the light scares me." I looked again down the hallway, where he was staring into the darkness. "Buddy, you see a light?" "Yes, Dad, it scares me." I picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs still stand on the back of my neck when I think of it. Spring break of 2010. My friends and I decided to camp out on an island at a local lake. One night, as we are cooking food and drinking beer, a canoe floats by with one guy in it. His question, how we're doing, and if we would invite him to our island for grilled meat and beers. Being in South Arkansas, we naturally assume that everyone is friendly and wants to hang out. His name was Kurt, and he was super friendly, but really seemed to be sad. We asked what was up, and he replied, "Oh, nothing really. It's just that my friends are worried about me." He looked at me and winked. "They'll find out soon enough." That still haunts me to this day. Everyone liked Kurt, and noticing that it was getting dark and he had been drinking, we offered to let him stay with us that night. He declined, saying that he had to get to where he was going, and he seemed very adamant about it. I then asked where he was headed, thinking maybe we could give him a ride on a jet ski or something. Kurt ignored the question and said, "You boys don't know how lucky you are." He hopped in his canoe and left. We didn't think much about it. The next morning, we woke up early to do some fishing. As we were fishing, a police boat pulls up. The officer then asked if we're part of the search party that found the body. We obviously have no clue what he's talking about, so he tells us a story about a young man in a canoe that disappeared last week. Apparently, divers found his body at the bottom of the lake 2 days before. The young man's name was Kurt. This was so scary for us all that we all packed up and left the camp that day. I was in the basement watching TV in the dark while my whole family was upstairs. As I'm chilling there, I hear footsteps coming down the basement stairs. And while I normally can tell which family member it is by the cadence, heaviness of the steps, I didn't recognize these. Then the footsteps stopped before reaching the bottom of the stairs. So I called out saying, "Ha ha, so scary. I know it's you," assuming that it was my brother or someone trying to scare me. I looked back to the TV, and the footsteps start again. I whip my head back to the stairs, just in time to see a dark figure go into a side room that has glass doors. It's pretty much pitch black, so I assumed whoever it was standing right behind the glass, looking at me. That's when I started to get scared, and so I ran to the lights and flipped them on, only to find the room empty. My entire family was still upstairs. It was too scary. My dad worked at a mental hospital that used to be connected by an underground passage to a nun's home that was now abandoned. He says that one night he was walking down there when he saw a praying nun. He walked by her and said hello, but she did not acknowledge him. My dad does not believe in a ghost, but he swears there was a nun down there that night. My grandma's house is in a small Midwestern town, a white and old-looking home on a farm. You get the picture. The worst part of all this is that she has a cemetery about a half a mile down the road. Anyway, I used to sleep in the room in the corner on the top floor, and it had a wooden rocking chair in it. When I was younger, I would wake up because I thought I heard it rocking, to the point where I would wake up my grandma and have to stay in her room. Well, about 10 years later, during Thanksgiving, we're talking about how creepy grandma's house was. My aunt goes on to talk about how when she was younger, the reason my mom and her ended up sharing a room was because she thought her room was haunted. She said she woke up one morning and the rocking chair was about 2 feet closer to her bed. And after that night, it would start rocking on a nightly basis at midnight.